Before anyone knew her name, before helicopters cut the sky or money started bending the truth, there was only a quiet road, a broken bicycle, and a choice that could not be undone. Some stories don't announce themselves with headlines. They whisper first, and by the time you realize what you've heard, your life is already different. If you believe that small acts of kindness can collide with enormous secrets, go ahead and like and subscribe as this story begins. You might find yourself agreeing with its heart long before you expect to. I remember the night clearly because nothing about it felt important at the time, and that's usually how fate gets you. It disguises itself as routine. The road that cut through Pine Hollow County had no street lights, just a narrow ribbon of asphalt bordered by trees that leaned inward like they were sharing secrets. It was close to midnight when Ethan Cole drove that road, one hand loose on the steering wheel, the other resting on the window frame. Radio turned low to avoid thinking too much. He took that road every night after his late warehouse shift because it shaved 10 minutes off the drive home, and because it was quiet enough to let grief settle without interruption. Ethan was a single dad in title only now, his daughter gone 3 years, his wife 5 before that, and the house he drove toward was more storage unit than home, a place where memories sat untouched because moving them felt like erasing proof they'd ever existed. The headlights swept across the trees, then across something that didn't belong, a flash of metal, a dark shape sprawled too close to the center line. He slowed instinctively, irritation flickering first, then confusion, then a sharp, cold jolt of fear as the shape resolved into a bicycle twisted at an unnatural angle and a body beside it, motionless, one arm bent beneath itself like it had forgotten how arms were supposed to work. Ethan pulled over without thinking, tires crunching gravel, engine still running as he stepped out into the damp night air, the smell of pine and wet earth thick enough to taste. The girl couldn't have been more than 16 or 17, blonde hair matted with blood at the temple, jeans torn at the knee, breath shallow but there. Alive. That mattered. He checked for traffic. There was none. Then knelt, every movement careful. The way you move when you know one wrong choice can turn a bad moment into an irreversible one. She flinched when he touched her shoulder, eyes fluttering open just long enough to show pure terror before rolling back again. No phone in sight. No car tracks. No houses for miles. His phone showed one bar, then none. He swore softly, the word disappearing into the trees. And in that moment he faced the kind of decision that sounds simple when retold, but feels impossibly heavy when you're the one standing there in the dark. Call it in and leave her alone on the roadside, hoping help arrived before shock did. Or take responsibility. Real responsibility. The kind that follows you home and doesn't let go. Ethan lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she was, how fragile a human life could feel in your arms, and placed her in the passenger seat of his truck, wrapping his old flannel jacket around her shoulders before driving the rest of the way home with one eye on the road and the other on her chest, counting breaths like numbers could keep her anchored. His house sat back from the road, porch light burned out months ago, door creaking open to a space that still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and dust. He laid her on the couch, cleaned the cut on her head with shaking hands and a first aid kit that hadn't been touched since his daughter skinned her knee in the driveway years earlier, then stepped back and waited, because sometimes waiting is the only thing left to do. When she finally woke, it was with a gasp, eyes wide and searching, body trying to retreat before realizing it had nowhere to go. Ethan raised his hands slowly, palms open, voice low and steady, explaining where she was, that she was safe, that no one was coming through that door unless she wanted them to. She stared at him like he was a test she didn't know how to pass, then whispered the only name she would give him, Lena. It wasn't until later that he noticed how carefully she avoided the windows, how she startled at the sound of tires on the distant highway, how she asked, more than once, if anyone had followed him. Ethan didn't push. He never had. That night, while Lena slept curled in on herself like she was trying to disappear, he sat in the armchair across the room, listening to the house settle, thinking about the last time he'd brought a stranger inside and how that had ended, and still knowing he'd do it again. Morning came gray and cold, and with it the low murmur of voices on the television Ethan turned on out of habit more than interest, until the words missing and reward cut through the static. A photograph filled the screen, a smiling blonde girl, polished and bright, the kind of smile practiced in front of cameras, framed by a name that hadn't yet been spoken in his house, but already felt too close for comfort. A national alert. Private search teams. A mother described as a powerful billionaire, beautiful and relentless, who had vowed not to sleep until her daughter was found. Ethan looked from the screen to the hallway where Lena slept and felt something shift under his ribs, something heavy and irreversible. He turned the television off. Outside, far off but unmistakable, a helicopter beat the air like a warning. Inside, a girl with bruises on her arms and fear in her eyes trusted him enough to sleep under his roof. Ethan didn't know it yet, but the choice he'd made on that quiet road had already set powerful things in motion, and the night he thought would end like all the others had only just begun. By the time the sun climbed high enough to burn the fog off Pine Hollow County, the world was already closing in on Ethan Cole's front door, though the house itself still sat in deceptive calm. Coffee gone cold on the counter, dust motes floating lazily through the living room, where Lena sat rigid on the couch, knees pulled to her chest, eyes fixed on the window, as if it were a loaded weapon. I could see how the quiet unnerved her more than chaos ever could. Silence leaves too much room for memory. Outside, the distant thump of helicopter blades came and went like a pulse, sometimes fading enough to make you hope you imagined it, then returning with a force that rattled something deep and instinctive in the chest. Ethan tried to keep things normal, if a life like his could still be called that. Scrambling eggs he barely tasted, speaking softly, asking questions that didn't demand answers. Lena flinched when a truck passed on the road, her hand flying unconsciously to the back of her ear, and that was when Ethan noticed it properly. A thin, crescent-shaped scar tucked just beneath her hairline, too precise to be from a fall, too deliberate to ignore. He didn't ask. He simply clocked it away, the way men who have already lost too much learn to do, because sometimes knowledge is dangerous until you know what to do with it. The knock came late morning, firm but not aggressive, the kind of knock designed to sound official without sounding threatening, and Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle fully for the first time. 2 county deputies stood on the porch, hats in hand, polite smiles stretched thin, eyes already scanning past Ethan's shoulder like the house itself might confess. "Sir," one of them said, "we're following up on reports of a possible sighting." Ethan listened, nodded, answered carefully, never technically lying, never offering more than asked, while behind him Lena froze so completely she might as well have turned to stone. The deputies left with apologies and business cards, but not before one of them glanced down the road, where black SUVs had begun to appear at irregular intervals, engines idling too quietly to belong to anyone local. That was when Ethan knew this wasn't just a missing person search anymore. It was something funded, something controlled, something that didn't wait patiently for consent. The afternoon unraveled fast after that. Phones buzzing despite no signal earlier, a neighbor stopping by under the pretense of borrowing sugar, eyes sharp with curiosity, news vans creeping closer to the county line like vultures circling a rumor. And then, just before dusk, the convoy arrived, smooth and inevitable, gravel crunching under tires that cost more than Ethan's truck had new. She stepped out of the lead car as if the world rearranged itself to accommodate her, tall and poised, blonde hair pulled back with deliberate simplicity, wearing grief like armor, so well tailored it almost looked like confidence. Vivian Hale didn't need an introduction. Her face had already lived on screens all day, composed and immaculate, the billionaire mother begging the world for her child, while privately daring it to stand in her way. When her eyes landed on Ethan, something flickered, calculation first, then restraint, and when they slid past him to Lena, that restraint cracked just enough to let raw, unfiltered pain leak through. "Lena," she breathed, and the sound of it was enough to make the air in the room feel thinner. The girl didn't move. She didn't run to her mother or collapse into her arms the way stories like this expect. Instead, she shrank back, fingers digging into the couch cushion, eyes darting to Ethan with something like panic. The room held its breath. Vivian noticed, of course. Women like her noticed everything. And the realization hit her like a second loss layered cruelly over the first. She stepped forward anyway, slow and careful now, hands open, voice gentle in a way no press conference had captured. "You're safe," she said, but the word sounded more like a plea than a promise. Lena shook her head, tears spilling freely now, and whispered something so quiet it barely existed. Please don't make me go back. That was the moment Ethan stepped between them. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to break the direct line of sight, and in doing so crossed an invisible line that would change all three of their lives. The security team stiffened. Vivian's gaze snapped back to him, sharp and incredulous, the look of a woman and used to resistance. She's my daughter, she said, not unkindly, but with an authority that expected compliance. Ethan nodded once, his voice steady despite the way his heart hammered against old scars. I know who you are, he replied, and I know what she is to you. But she's terrified, and until I understand why, she's not going anywhere she doesn't want to. The words landed heavy, absurd on paper, a warehouse worker standing his ground against a billionaire, but there was something about the way he said them, something rooted and immovable, that made the room pause. Vivian looked at her daughter again, really looked this time, at the bruises she hadn't yet seen on her wrists, the way she flinched when one of the guards shifted his weight, and the truth began to rearrange itself in her mind, piece by terrible piece. What happened to you? Vivian asked softly, and Lena broke, sobs tearing out of her like they'd been waiting for permission. Between gasps, the story spilled. Not the full story, not yet, but enough to fracture the image the world had been shown. She talked about running, about being kept, about people who smiled in public and watched too closely in private, about not knowing who to trust when money made everyone dangerous. Ethan listened, jaw tight, while Vivian's face drained of color, her hand trembling as it rose to her mouth. The enemy, it became clear, was not some faceless stranger in the dark, but a truth that lived uncomfortably close to home, tied to contracts and loyalty and the kind of power that insulated itself from consequences. When Lena finally fell silent, exhausted, Vivian straightened slowly, something hard and focused settling into her eyes. She met Ethan's gaze then, not as a superior, not as a desperate mother, but as a woman who understood that he had done what her world had failed to do. He had chosen her daughter over convenience, over fear, over the safest possible option. I won't force her, Vivian said at last, and the words seemed to surprise even her own people. Not today. The helicopters kept circling, the media kept waiting, but inside that small house, an uneasy truce took shape. Fragile, temporary, and charged with the knowledge that whatever had driven Lena into the night was not finished yet, and that protecting her would cost more than anyone in that room had fully counted. By the time the truth finally surfaced, it did so the way all dangerous truths do, quietly at first, then all at once, collapsing carefully constructed worlds under its weight. I watched it unfold from the edge of the room as Vivian Hale made the choice that would redefine her legacy, not as a billionaire, not as a visionary CEO, but as a mother who had finally understood the cost of her blindness. The scar behind Lena's ear wasn't just medical. It was technological, the remnant of a proprietary tracking implant developed by a subsidiary Vivian herself had quietly greenlit years earlier, sold as elite security for families who could afford fear more than trust. Lena hadn't been kidnapped by strangers. She had been hidden, monitored, controlled by people paid to protect her, people who decided autonomy was a liability. When Lena ran, she wasn't escaping danger. She was escaping ownership. The revelation detonated everything. Executives resigned overnight. Lawyers descended. Stock prices wobbled. But none of that mattered inside the hospital room, where Lena finally agreed to be examined, her hand locked tightly around Ethan's like she was afraid the world might steal her again if she let go. Vivian stood across from them, stripped of polish now, mascara smudged, shoulders sagging under the weight of what she had unknowingly sanctioned. And when she spoke, it wasn't for cameras or courts, it was for her daughter. She didn't beg. She didn't justify. She apologized, fully and without condition, and promised something no contract could enforce: that Lena would never again be protected at the cost of her freedom. The fallout was swift and brutal. Vivian dismantled the division responsible, testified voluntarily, and funneled billions into restitution and reform, but the most radical thing she did was step back, letting others lead while she stayed present, really present, for the first time in Lena's life. As for Ethan, The world tried to reward him in ways it always does when it doesn't know how else to say thank you. Money, offers, attention, but he refused most of it, keeping only what would allow him to build something that had been missing when Lena needed it most. A place where kids could land without being claimed. The house in Pine Hollow became a foundation headquarters, then a refuge, staffed quietly, funded securely, and run with one non-negotiable rule: no child stayed unless they chose to. Lena didn't move back into her mother's glass-walled world right away. She stayed with Ethan through the winter, healing slowly, relearning how to sleep without flinching, how to laugh without checking exits, how to exist without being watched. Vivian visited, never announced, never demanding more than Lena was ready to give. Sitting at the kitchen table where grief once lived, and learning how to be small in a space where love mattered more than power. Spring came, and with it, a fragile peace. Lena eventually went home, not to the empire she'd fled, but to a version of family rebuilt on consent and care. And on the day she left, she hugged Ethan longer than anyone else, whispering something only he was meant to hear. I didn't need to know the words to understand their weight. Months later, when the headlines had moved on and the helicopters were long gone, I returned to Pine Hollow and found Ethan on the porch at dusk, watching the road where everything had begun. He told me he still drove it sometimes, still slowed at the bend where a broken bicycle once lay, not out of fear, but remembrance. Because some nights change you forever, and some choices echo far beyond the moment they're made. Lena sends letters now, no addresses, no signatures the world would recognize, just updates about school, about painting, about learning how to trust herself again. Vivian funds the foundation quietly, deliberately avoiding credit, understanding at last that not every good deed needs a spotlight. And Ethan? He stays where he is, keeping the porch light fixed, the door unlocked, believing with a steadiness earned through loss that kindness doesn't need permission to matter. The quiet road is still quiet, but it carries a different weight now, one shaped by the knowledge that a single human decision, made without witnesses, without reward, can interrupt even the most powerful machinery and remind the world that safety, real safety, is built not by control, but by choice.